Hi there, and welcome. My name is Jeff Bell, and on behalf of McLean Hospital, I'd like to thank you for joining us for a session we're calling the Teen Mental Health Playbook, Tips Every Parent Needs. Let's be honest, parenting a teen can be tough. It can feel like navigating uncharted waters, especially when it comes to mental health. So, our goal is to offer some effective strategies for supporting your teen's emotional well-being in today's fast-paced, high-pressure world. Here to help us do that is Dr. Holly Peak, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist affiliated with Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital. Holly, thanks so much for making time for us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to have you with us. You have worked with a lot of teens over the years. You know firsthand how critical these teenage years are. Let's start there. When it comes to mental health, why are these particular years so important?
There is so much going on in the adolescent brain and in the adolescent life as a whole. So during these years, there's a lot of things going on biologically and developmentally in the teenage brain. But on top of that, teenagers are trying to figure out who they want to be in the world, making social connections, deciding what they want to do in next steps of their life. So it's a time of great development and great learning and also of great vulnerability too.
What's at stake in terms of what happens with that development during these teenage years?
I think, when we look at teenage mental health, 50% of adult mental health disorders start by the age of 14. So when we think about what we're setting our kids up for during this time of development, we're really kind of setting them up for the rest of their lives. So there is a lot at stake in terms of how we are paying attention to their mental health and treating it.
Let's talk about some of the challenges of being a teenager today. Let's face it, it's not easy to be a teen in this day and age. Can you break out for us some of the specific challenges that teens face as they go through this phase of their life?
Absolutely. Well, I think that teenagers have the challenges that they've always had in many ways in terms of figuring out, like I said, their identity, who they want to be in this world, navigating different social dynamics, navigating their part in family dynamics, asserting independence while also figuring out how they want to live their life. I think more recently, in the past decade or so, with the introduction of social media, it throws in a whole different wrench in terms of what kids are experiencing in terms of their challenges with all of those things that I just mentioned.
I mentioned that the world seems to be speeding up. How is that impacting teens? I think things seem more competitive by the year. There are more stressors put on teens. What is the cumulative effect of that speeding up of things for them?
Mhm. I think in so many ways, if life is so sped up, kids and teenagers lose that opportunity of development and that opportunity of exploration and play. Look, if you're always trying to keep up with those around you, you throw in social media and comparisons a teenager might be making to their peers. In addition, comparisons that teenagers' parents might be making to their peers' children's. It creates this pressure cooker that I feel like starts younger and younger and younger. So within that cooker, there's a loss of freedom and independence when there's all of this pressure and speeding up in their developmental life and this pressure to succeed.
I'd be remiss, Holly, not to ask you about the impact of the pandemic. This is a generation that was isolated to a large degree for a good chunk of their either preteen or early teen years. Talk about the impact that that is likely to have had and what you have seen in your own practice.
Absolutely. Anecdotally, I meet so many teenagers now when I'm asking them, when did your struggles start? When did things get difficult? Inevitably, so many of them point back to 2020 and 2021 and that loss of socialization, that loss of normal school structure, and this increased isolation that they experienced, and kind of moving their life in person to life in the digital world, and now trying to come back into life in person and the challenges that they experienced. So I think in so many ways, teenagers experience the same challenges that we all have. At the same time, the additional challenge is that they missed out in this whole developmental stage when they're supposed to be socializing and figuring out what they want to be in the world, yet in this isolated bubble of COVID. And so I think we're still seeing reverberations of that even now.
Wow. Again, it's tough to be a teenager on a good day at a good time. We will circle back to those specific challenges that teenagers face day to day, but I want to sort of broaden the discussion to roll into it, a look at some of the basic mental health disorders that teens also face, and then we'll sort of tease out what's what. Can you give us the landscape, if you would, for what mental health challenges look like for a typical teen?
Absolutely. So we have our mood disorders like major depression would probably be the most common mood disorder that teens experience. To a certain extent, there's also bipolar disorder and other mood disorders as well, but we see a lot of major depression. Generalized anxiety is huge. Eating disorders is something that we've seen more and more of. And also behavioral type issues such as ADHD might be at play, substance use disorders. Really, most things that adults also experience often kind of start during those teenage years, but those are probably some main ones that I see.
I have to ask you, because you talked about the key role developmentally of the teenage years, to what degree is early intervention critical for these clinically diagnosable disorders?
Think it is so, so crucial because I think in general, so many people suffer in silence with their mental illnesses. And it isn't until they're way down and spiraling until they're trying to dig themselves back up and to seek help. I think early intervention with teenagers, particularly, can get them into a healthier space and them back on track developmentally, which is crucial for brain development during a very crucial time of brain development in one's life, and also social development as they're learning coping skills and strategy and navigating the social world, how important that is. So early intervention can really get someone who's straight away from a quote normal developmental path back onto the right track.
And we'll talk a little bit more about how to watch for some of those signs that can help a parent get involved with early intervention. But I have to ask you a very important question here. How does a parent tease out what's what? I mean, let's face it, teens can be moody just by the nature of being a teenager. There are behavior aspects of being a teenager that are very common as well. How is a parent supposed to know what is typical teen behavior and what is something needing more support, perhaps professionally?
Right. And I think that is such a common issue that parents face. What is this normal teen angst and these normal, what might feel emotional roller coaster of being a teenager, and what is actually a sign of depression and anxiety? And I think when in doubt, seek help. That might be starting with your child's pediatrician for some screening tools. So when in doubt, seek some help and guidance from the professionals. But I think in general, what parents can notice as warning signs might be a change in your teenager's regular routine. Are they isolating? Are they pulling away? Do they seem to be spending less time with their friends, not engaging with their family? Anything that's an abrupt change from your teenager's baseline. Different things that we all need in terms of sleeping and eating. And like I said, socializing, any changes in sleep patterns, eating, decreasing grades, an abrupt change in school performance. These all might be warning signs that you can see and that you might notice first.
Before we move forward from there, it might be worth going through that list that you gave us a couple minutes back in terms of some of the common disorders that are impacting teens, and any particular flags that come up for them. Anxiety disorders.
Yeah, so anxiety disorders, when we think about anxiety, the big one would be generalized anxiety disorder. So in a big broad stroke kind of way, it would be excessively worrying about ruminating on day-to-day things or worrying a lot about the future Where am I going to go to college? What am I going to be when I grow up? Am I going to be okay? Am I going to be successful? Or ruminating things on from the past. Did I do okay the other day on that test? So all these excessive worries that can happen in generalized anxiety disorder that can impact someone's day-to-day functioning. So that might impact sleep at night. And sleep is so, so, so important, but it might prevent someone from getting enough or good quality sleep. It might cause someone to have some avoidance or withdrawal behaviors from their regular activities, might be some signs of generalized anxiety disorder.
How about eating disorders? They tend to be associated so often, at least in the conversation nationally, with teenagers. Is there a prevalence amongst eating disorders? Do teens make up a larger proportion of that population than others?
Absolutely. We see the beginning stages of eating disorders kind of starting even in the preteen years, but definitely into the teenage years and on into adulthood. So the prevalence that we see often is during the teenage years. And that really ranges from a broad scope of different eating disorders, such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. There are many different eating disorders that we can see in our teens, and they often start in the teenage years.
And are there particular signs that you would advise parents to watch for?
Absolutely. So going back to what I said before, any change in baseline, if your child was someone who always seemed to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, asking for a snack after school, and then all of a sudden you're seeing they're bringing their home lunch, bringing their lunch home from school, or throwing food away, or making excuses to skip dinner, those could all be warning signs. So anything a change from someone's baseline eating. I think physically, any sort of abrupt weight loss or change in medical status should be a question brought to the pediatrician. Why is my adolescent falling off their growth curve in one way or the other? Because it could be excessive weight gain as well, or any sort of change from the baseline would be some warning signs. And then also often with malnourishment in and of itself, you can see anxiety, depression, irritability, things like that too.
How about personality disorders? Any particular red flags for parents to watch for?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think it's important to note that personality disorders often aren't diagnosed until the age of 18. That being said, we see traits and we can certainly see personality characterological patterns in those younger than 18. And so yeah, those younger than 18 are often getting the diagnosis too. But I think if you see any sort of pervasive pattern of emotional instability or reactivity that's really getting in the way of the child's life, or the development of a pervasive pattern of a development of maladaptive coping skills, which might be self-harm, right? Or substance abuse, or even eating disorder behaviors, any sort of maladaptive coping that seems it's kind of taken over your child's life, or interpersonally they seem to struggle more than their peers. I think that could be a warning sign.
You mentioned substance use and misuse. Let's talk a little bit about that because that certainly is an issue for teenage years as well. What do parents need to know about substance use and when it becomes problematic for their teens?
Right, right. Well, and I think it's important to note that teenage substance use can be really quite common and unfortunately normalized in a lot of different areas of society. When you take a step back, we think about how important this period of brain development is, and any excessive exposure to alcohol, marijuana, or any sort of THC products can really interrupt that important biological, physiological brain development that's going on in a teen. So I think that teenage substance use exists. And I think that's important to acknowledge because teens by nature are impulsive, taking risks, trying to fit in with their peers. So there's going to be some experimentation here and there. But if it seems to be something that they're getting in trouble with it, they're intoxicated at school. Got caught several times with this. You've created rules and boundaries in your house around it, and they continue to violate that. I think those are some warning signs that this is more than just teenage rebellion and experimentation.
And then let me circle back to mood disorders, because again, I imagine that's a tricky one because as we all know who have parented teenagers, they can be moody by the nature of being a teenager.
Right.
But there are signs that something is amiss beyond that for some of these teenagers. Talk a little bit about what to watch for in terms of mood disorders and especially depression.
Right, right. And I think it's important to note that we all have really crummy days from time to time. And
Sure.
so I often explain to parents and teenagers, it would be weird if you didn't had a bad day from time to time. However, if it is pervasive and lasting weeks on end of having a low mood, isolation, withdrawal, that's where I would differentiate things. So symptoms of depression can certainly by nature be depressed mood, low mood that's pervasive for long stretches of time. But we also see changes in sleep. We also see changes in interest and desire to enjoy activities they would usually enjoy. We see changes in appetite that can go one way or the other. Could be an excessive appetite and overeating or not eating enough. You might see changes in school performance due to and all the things I stated above, but also changes in concentration level. But I think also a big, big red flag is expressing desire that life isn't worth living in some way, or hopelessness, or actually expressing a desire to hurt themselves. That's never normal. And that's always, always, always should raise huge red flags that this is more than just teenage angst and being in a bad mood.
And Holly, because that's such a critical point right there, let's take a moment to talk about crisis intervention for parents. What do you want to share on that front as some important steps that they can take immediately?
Yeah. And I think if you're worried about your kids' safety, or if they've expressed to you any of these thoughts of wanting to hurt themselves, always take it seriously. And if there is a treatment team in place, then reaching out to who the treatment team might be, whether that's a therapist, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, to get some guidelines around that. One can always go to the emergency room or call 911 if there is no other safety net in place. Many communities also have crisis intervention, either centers or even mobile units that can come to the house to help evaluate for safety.
Let's talk a little bit about getting professional help. As you said, that there are many times that it makes sense to reach out to a professional to be part of the process. Um, are there some thresholds that you should watch for as a parent that would suggest to you that maybe it's time to bring in a professional? Let's start with that.
Yeah. Number one, if your kid is asking for it, that's a big sign. I've certainly, I think a lot of times people don't want to believe because it can be so personally painful that your kid is struggling. And if they're asking for some sort of help, honor that and figuring out what that's about. Some other thresholds, it could go in the opposite direction. You're noticing some changes in your kid, but they don't want any help. I think that if you're really seeing changes in their baseline functioning that don't seem to be getting better, really kind of insisting with your child, what might they be agreeable to do? Would you be agreeable to meet with this person one time for an evaluation? Would you be agreeable to meet with this person 5 times? If there's a lot of hesitancy, see where you can find common ground to get them in the door. Because often, if someone can get a foot in the door in treatment, even the most reluctant, they can get something out of it. So really finding strategies for buy-in with your teen if they are reluctant.
I can imagine that a lot of parents who might be watching this right now say, that sounds great, but where do I start? How do I find a therapist for my teen?
I think it can be
General
difficult.
thoughts, some suggestions?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it depends what community you are in, but in general, you can start from your insurance company and getting a list of child and adolescent psychiatrists or child and adolescent specialized therapists that might be in your area. You might get quite the long list and it might be a lot of phone call making, but you can get a list of resources often from your insurance company of people who are provided in network. Most, if not every kid has a pediatrician who has had experiences with other providers in the community. They might have a list of referrals to provide as well. So I think those are two big overarching things to look at. Look at your insurance company to see what might be a network. Talk to your pediatrician.
Treatment itself is a little bit beyond the scope of this particular conversation today, but I would like you to share a few thoughts in terms of the efficacy of treatment for some of these disorders that we've talked about. I know you've seen a lot of success stories through your own work over the years.
Absolutely. And I think it can be challenging at time, but success is definitely there. And there are so many different modalities of treatment that I think, as you said, are beyond the focus of this discussion. But you have a combination of a variety of different therapies that can address all the disorders that we talked about. There are also medications that can be quite efficacious and that are approved by the FDA that can also be helpful for teenagers. And often it takes the combination of the two, depending on the situation, to really help. And I might add that given our world is so virtual in many ways, there are more and more telehealth options that exist in the past several years compared to what it may have been decades ago. And that really can help with access as well. And a lot of those telehealth companies are nationwide and take insurance, and can offer a variety of therapies, med management, and whatnot. You just have to look for it.
Great. Well, let's get practical now. I know that a lot of folks who are watching this webinar today are saying, "I want some specific tips. I want some strategies. Help me. What can I do specifically?" Let's start with communication because that's such a big one. What guidance do you have for parents for increasing communication with their kids and specifically their teen kids?
Absolutely. I think that, gosh, communicating with a teenager is tough because in many ways it's developmentally normal that they might be pulling a bit away from their family as their focus is more outward to their friends. So a decreased amount of communication with your teen to a certain degree is normal, but we need to learn how to bridge that gap and bridge the divide to keep that channel of communication still open. I think that many different families have different rituals around communication that exist, that can look several of different ways. Family dinners, in the car driving your kid to school, having a check-in, have a scheduled family game night, um, checking in before you go to bed, and it doesn't have to be a huge check-in, just ask how their day was. Everyone put their phones down and ask them how their day was, because that is a foot in the door. That is a ritual around communication that happens regularly, several days a week. And the kid very well may still give you very little, but when there's something to say and something they need, that they know that that door is always open. So I think that is a baseline thing that most people are able to do.
Any thoughts on how to make your kids feel comfortable talking to you in terms of that they can trust you and that they can come to you with whatever their challenge might be that they feel like they need to discuss?
Oh boy. I think coming at it from a non-judgmental place, although maybe so hard at times, is important as a parent to keep in the back of your mind, saying, I will listen to what's going on with my child. I will validate how hard that might be. I may have expectations of what their behavior should be, but I am going to try to respond and listen in a non-judgmental way to the best of my ability, because that will keep the door open. The moment that judgment or quick to advice giving or quick to anger comes into play, the less likely they'll come to you in the future. So you want to find the balance of holding standards and expectations and consequences for your teen, but keeping that door open so that they'll come to you knowing that in the moment you're coming from a non-judgmental, validating space.
One of the important things that parents can do is help their teens learn to manage their emotions. I mean, we've talked about that several times now in terms of the challenges of being a teenager. Are there specific strategies that you can recommend for parents to be effective on that front in helping guide emotional development for their teens?
Absolutely. And I think that it's important to note that kids, teenagers learn more from what we do than what we say. They certainly remember more than like what they witness than what we might preach to them. So learning to manage our own adult emotions in appropriate ways will pay off tenfold from what your kid is taking in terms of how to manage their emotions. In terms of making suggestions of how one might can self-soothe in the moment. For example, let's say a kid is really upset. They got in a fight with a friend and they're really dysregulated. Ask them what can they do right now to make themselves feel better. Sometimes listening to the music. Do they need to cook? Do they need to go outside and do a hobby that they usually enjoy? So I think the combination of modeling appropriate emotion regulation and asking questions and listening to our kids and making gentle suggestions of what might be helpful in the moment if they're finding a hard time figuring out what is helpful for themselves in that moment.
I'm so glad you mentioned that last point because I'm thinking about my own parenting challenges over the years. And I think it's a difficult thing for a lot of parents not to just jump into problem solving. I used the
Absolutely.
word gently suggesting. Um, Talk a little bit more about that and what a teen does and does not want to hear from mom or dad in terms of getting involved and solving the problem for them.
Absolutely. I think that it's so easy to go into problem solving mode because what might be so clear for the adult on how to solve this problem, the kid who's in a different developmental mind space might come to their own conclusion in a very secure circular way. So I think always asking to start, and if you find yourself wanting to make a suggestion right off the bat, ask first. Do you want some suggestions here? Would it be helpful if I made some suggestion? And if the kid says no, don't solve it for them. Maybe they just want an ear to listen. So I think that should be like the first stop. If the kid says, yes, that would be very helpful, the door's open. You can go into problem solving mode, but always taking a beat before you jump into that problem solving mode. Kids or teenagers are also developing their own problem solving skills during this period of time too. They're not always thinking of the long-term consequences of their actions. They're often acting on emotion in the moment because they have that amygdala mind that they are responding to. They don't have this part of their brain fully formed yet that is into logistics and critical thinking and problem solving. So maybe reminding them, well, this could be the long-term consequence of this decision. This could be the short-term consequence of this decision, helping them to think it through without outright solving it. But I think always asking like, how much do you want me to be involved in this, or are you coming to me for an ear?
And one more follow-up question on that front. In terms of validating the situation that a teen might be in,
Mhm.
how does a parent walk that line between validating what the teen might be feeling and essentially signing off or condoning the behavior itself or the thinking process itself?
Right. I think by definition, validation doesn't mean agreement. And I think that teenagers often get that twisted and might react to it. But validation is that must be really hard. That sounds really difficult because it is. That's a fact. The kid is coming to you with this difficult situation. Even if you disagree with it or it's unreasonable, that's irrelevant. And again, it's towing that line of certainly having certain standards and expectations of your child, which may vary from household to household, and still holding that. You can still hold all those things. You can still have consequences for reactions, but you can also acknowledge how hard it is in the moment too.
That makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about self-esteem, which seems to be a problem for a lot of teenagers or a challenge for a lot of teenagers. It's tough with all the peer pressure and everything that's being expected of them to not sort of beat up on themselves sometimes in terms of how they feel about themselves. What can we as parents do to help on that front?
Gosh, I think starting with ourselves, going back to the modeling piece, how do we talk about and treat ourselves? Anecdotally, when I've worked with a lot of teenagers who have eating disorders and who struggle with their body image in particularly, and I ask them, when did your negative body image start? Like when did these negative thoughts about yourself start? Well, I heard my parents talk negatively about their own bodies starting at the age of 6. That's when I started noticing it. And so really, gosh, going back to what I said, kids pay attention to how we act more than what we say. I think a lot of parents are horrified that their kids picked up on that, but they do. So modeling how we talk about ourselves and how we talk about others too can go a long way in how kids are thinking and judging about themselves. Media literacy is a huge thing too. I think a low self-esteem often can come from social media and comparisons that kids are making to their peers and others is problematic as well. So bringing attention to what is quote real or not real or altered or edited in the social media world is really important. And then also finding areas in which we can encourage and compliment our kids on things that are about them and their inner lives, not necessarily about accomplishments or appearances. You're so kind. What a great friend you were to your best friend. Um, Things like that and commenting on what you've noticed that's complimentary about your kids' inner world and themselves can go a lot further on complimenting them on getting some prize.
That is such an interesting point, and it seems like there's been a lot more discussion about that in parenting circles lately. This notion that, I'm so proud of you for getting straight A's is something completely different from I'm so proud of how hard you're working at school.
Exactly, exactly. And don't get me wrong, you can still be incredibly proud that the kid got straight A's. They're probably pretty proud of themselves for getting straight A's too. But holding both sides of that, that's awesome. You got great straight A's. That's so good for you. And gosh, do you know what I admire the most? How hard you worked to get there. So you can hold both pieces of that. And I think that that can help build a sense of identity because the straight A's is not who they are. Their hardworking might be a character trait of who they are.
And what guidance do you have for parents responding to negative self-talk from their teen?
Mhm,
Because that can be tough. Again, we've talked a little bit about validation and validating that they might be feeling that way. Um,
mhm,
but that seems like an especially tricky area for parenting of teens.
I think it is, and gosh, it can be so hard to hear as a parent too, to hear your child talk so negatively
Yeah.
about themselves. I think be curious about where that's coming from without obviously without agreeing with them. But let's say for going back to the body image example, if your teenager is commenting, gosh, I'm so fat, like I hate the way I look. Just be curious. And if that's a new statement, it seems to be coming out of nowhere or certainly an ongoing pattern, be curious about where is this coming from? When did that start? Like ask questions without agreement. Asking questions and being curious is going to go a lot further than no, you're not. Because that's an invalidating statement because that's not what the kid is experiencing. And it kind of gets you no more information about what's truly going on in their inner world. So remain taking that curious stance without agreeing.
Let me ask you next about helping a teenager build independence. And again, I was going to say a tricky one. It seems like they're all tricky. But
They
but
are.
yeah, that's a tough one for parents to be able to draw some boundaries. You want to let the line out a little bit in terms of giving them more space and responsibility, but obviously you have to be careful not to give them too much. Give us some guidance here. How do we tackle all of that?
I think having very, very clear boundaries and expectations around the independence that you're given and some real consequences that you're going to follow through on if the independence and trust is violated. So I think that we don't want to coddle our children. So much of this stage of life is building a sense of identity and a sense of independence. You've built the roots, but you also want to build the wings too so that they can fly. So finding that balance in terms of, and again, this balance is going to be different for every family and every culture within a family about how much independence within the family is expected and feels reasonable. But as you put it, letting the line out a little bit, curfew is an easy one to think about.
Sure.
But the same way to think about it can be applied to many other things. For this 10th grade year, I'd like you home by 11 p.m. And if you're consistent with that, next year you can be home by midnight, and seeing how they handle that. And if curfew is continuously violated, be clear that, well, we just roll back because clearly we can't handle that level of independence of being home at a certain time. So you might have to adjust the level of independence that a teenager is given, and give them a little more independence if they are consistently doing what they need to do, and also maintaining their other responsibilities in life, like maintaining your grades. Someone might require their teenager to have a job to have their spending money. Again, that's just going to differ from family to family. But I think where people run into trouble is when they might have a curfew, for instance, for someone, and the kid is consistently late and then nothing happens. That's
Yeah.
when, teenagers are really pushing boundaries to see what happens. And there should be some sort of consequence, because the lesson is that you can't continually push boundaries in life without there being a very real consequence.
We've talked a lot about the challenges of being a teenager. Let's talk a
Mhm.
little bit about some self-care guidance for parents, because this is a tough thing too, as we've been stressing over and over again here. Um, from your perspective, as somebody who's worked with a lot of families, what is toughest for parents when it comes to these particular navigation strategies with their children and their teens specifically?
Mhm. I think, oh, so many tough things. It's hard to it's hard to pick one.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that can be particularly hard is and challenging is what might feel so clear and obvious to you feels as if the kid is just in this emotional roller coaster with no critical thinking or logic whatsoever, and might be very reactive to you or pushing you away when all you want to do is help. So I think that can be really, really challenging. And I think some strategies are showing your kids some grace, knowing that biologically they're going through the ringer, but showing yourself some grace too, because this is the first time they're doing life. This is the first time you're doing life. And none of us are going to be perfect at it. So I think that can be really challenging to kind of see the emotional turmoil, not having that also impact your inner world.
Suggestions for parents who feel like they need some support. Um, are there times when professional help is warranted for addressing some of this exhaustion? Are there peer groups? What are some recommendations you might have?
Really all of the above, but I'm just thinking that there are therapists. If your child is in therapy, there are therapists who also offer parental guidance type therapies. Even if your kid is refusing therapy or refusing to get into any treatment, there are parent only or parental guidance type therapists that exists that one could get support from. Like you mentioned, there's also peer groups that exist throughout communities or in certain clinics where you can be with other parents and hear how they did it. Here's some tips of how they went through it. And if let's say it's a specific support group for parents of kids with anxiety, that's going to be really specific for you in getting some help. You'll get your own validation of how hard it is to be in that situation, which can be very helpful for anybody, but also getting some tips and tricks from other parents who are in the same boat real life.
We have a little time left, Holly, and I want to use that to zero in on some specific topics that we've touched on just briefly along the way. Um, bullying. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts in terms of how parents can help teens navigate that horrific challenge of being bullied at school or elsewhere?
Yes, I think that, gosh, this is unfortunately an issue that has been around for decades and decades, this part of bullying. But I think now, in this day and age, social media adds a whole nother element to it, where before, when kids were bullied, they might be bullied between 9 and 3 p.m. school hours, but they're at home the rest of the time and the weekends and getting reprieve. Now, if someone's being bullied, they're being bullied in the virtual world at their fingertips 24/7. So I think monitoring social media use and creating a life outside of their phone can be a long way in kind of separating your child from any sort of bullying experience that may be occurring. If it is significant and severe, get the school involved. Most schools do have some sort of protocol for intervention if bullying is pervasive and really problematic for your child. It can be so tricky to navigate. And I think that schools and support systems do have ways that can help.
Next up on my list was going to be social media. You touched on that vis-a-vis bullying as well. Um, Pulling back the lens a little bit more broadly in terms of teens' use of social media, what guidance do you have for parents in potentially limiting it in a realistic way? I mean, it'd be tempting to say, well, just tell your kids they can't spend that much time on their phones doing social media. You
Mhm.
and I both know it doesn't work quite that way.
Right. I think having some phone-free zones or time in your home that applies to everybody, including you. If if the rule is we have dinner together at the table with no phones, you as a parent have to put your phone away too. And that's the rule. No screens right there for that hour. If there's no phones in the bedroom after 9 p.m., everyone has to follow that too. So I think they're really just like there have always been curfews and rules that people have to follow in their real life, it makes sense in our digital worlds, there are curfews and rules that one should be expected to follow too. It can't be that we have rules and things to follow in the house, but we just go wild in our digital world. It, there's a digital world and there's the real life world, and we need rules around all of it. And that's going to differ from household to household. But I think it's important that those rules apply to everyone in the house, including the adults, that the adults are modeling appropriate and healthy social media boundaries, and that we're paying attention to how much we're all on our phones.
Dating. What should parents know about that challenge for their teens and the
Mhm.
challenges that that will likely create for them as parents as well? And this
Mhm.
is another whole discussion, I realize that, but give us some of the highlights in terms of your thoughts on this front.
Yes, and in many ways, I think the dating world again is always been something that's a tricky situation for parents to navigate, and
Sure.
each house is going to have their own rules about what age you can start dating, what are the rules around that. I think that what parents sometimes have more challenges with is when the kids have different sort of preferences than what the parents might expect for their children in terms of do they identify as homosexual? Do they identify as bisexual? Do they identify as asexual? I think these are elements in the parenting world these days that weren't talked about as much in the past, and how we want to have an open ear. We want to come to these conversations in a validating, accepting, and loving way, and be curious about what our kids are interested about in our dating world. And then, of course, as it always have has been, have discussions about sexual boundaries, sexual health, and what is appropriate and not appropriate when it comes to dating relationships.
Academic challenges.
Mhm.
A lot of pressure put on kids today. We've talked a little bit about how to reinforce, kids doing their best at school and so forth, as opposed to just, saying great job, straight A's, and something less than that, giving them lesser feedback. Um, what else do you want to pass along to parents in terms of helping their kids navigate the challenges of academic pressure?
Absolutely. I think that sometimes something that we haven't hit on yet, and when we think about academic challenges, is if your child is persistently and your teenager's persistently having issues in in what seems to be one particular subject, they're always falling behind, or they don't like that teacher, or they avoid doing their homework, or avoid school altogether because of this particular class. Be curious as to what that's about. Is there an underlying learning disorder? Do they need some tutoring help? Most people, most teenagers want to do well. They're not showing up in life not wanting to do well. What is getting in the way and impairing a teenager from fulfilling what they could achieve academically? So instead of getting mad, like why aren't they performing well at X, Y, and Z? Be curious as to why they aren't performing well at X, Y, and Z, and get them the support that they need. And early intervention with that is important too, so a kid doesn't fall too far behind, and so that those challenges don't impact their self-esteem and self-worth to an infinite degree.
Let me squeeze in one more question. In your experience, what role can siblings play in a constructive way in the
Hmm.
family dynamic of helping a teenager get through these difficult years?
Hmm. Hmm. Gosh, I think that siblings can play an integral role in like building up their siblings and having a positive experience. However, what I hear a lot about is bullying at home and how that sometimes gets put up with in ways that would never be accepted at school. And just realizing that just as we shouldn't permit bullying our kids bullying other kids, they shouldn't be bullying their siblings either, saying mean things, certainly not getting physical with their siblings, and really have boundaries around what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior, because how they treat their siblings growing up is going to have some transfer in how they're treating other people or what they're accepting from other people and treatment out in the real world too. So I think siblings can be a wonderful part of social development, of connection, of building relationships and self-esteem, but also paying attention to the other side in our parenting and like, where is this going awry and what are we putting up with and what do we need to try to address?
We always try to pass along resources that might be helpful for our viewers.
Mhm.
Parents who are watching and looking for more information about some of these topics that we've touched on, do
Mhm.
you have any favorite resources that you want to point people to, whether they're books or organizations, websites, videos? What
Yeah.
comes to mind?
My first go-to is ACAP, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. They have a wealth of information of all things child, teenager, young adult mental health related, all the way from medications to therapies to diagnoses, and they can really point you in the right direction. So, and that is the big child and adolescent psychiatry national organization. So that would be my first go-to.
Great. And then finally, as we start to wrap things up here, I want to ask you to kind of help us end on a positive note. You've worked with a lot of families, as we've talked about over the years.
Mhm.
Um, Share the promise of getting through this in terms of helping your teen navigate these teenage years, helping them get through them, helping yourself get through them,
Mhm.
knowing that there's professional help out there. Talk about the hope that is afforded through all these resources that are available to folks going through this.
Well, there's something that can be said is that we're all of us, if we're lucky enough, go through this teenage stage and
Yeah.
make it on into adulthood. It's a temporary state that is both dictated by our biology and our brains and our hormones, social development, but we get on through the other side. And we got to show ourselves grace. We got to show our teenagers grace that they're going to get through this. Life can be hard, but getting through these hard things is what can bring our character and strengths alive. So I think even the fact that anyone's watching this, we're all doing our best to do life and get through it.
Ollie, I want to thank you again for being our guest today and helping us better understand teen mental health and the vital role that parents can play in helping their teenagers navigate these critical years. Such an important topic. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Holly Peak, and to those of you watching, thank you for your interest in our educational outreach. We hope you'll come back for our future presentations, and we wish you a wonderful day.